without any further ado, I'm going to kick things off. So, Justin, I appreciate you taking time to do this virtual interview. Now, you know, these are very, very surreal times. Just to give our listening audience some context, so Justin joins us from the NYPDC. Now, I wanted to really get an idea from Justin. Justin's doing some amazing stuff in New York from you know, urban design, planning, regeneration, and I think this is a great chance for us to see what the reaction has been in New York and what the plans may be going forward. So to kick things off, Justin, can you tell us what it is that you love about urban areas in particular, and why you see yourself as an urbanist?
Sure. Well, I grew up in Indianapolis, sort of a 1 million or so city in the Midwest of the United States. And so it's actually a big part of my identity. I grew up being a city kid. And it's interesting kind of growing up in the city when you would just go around to different parts of the city or go outside of the city. It was sort of instantly kind of something that I was aware of, like how different places are. And that, you know, places have meaning and they have value in many different ways. You know, I grew up in a predominantly Black, predominantly African-American community. And so, you know, kind of understanding the differences, both good and bad, that you would see in different parts of cities was something that I always just was interested in and found to be important in one way or another. And also, you know, cities are, you know, are spaces and buildings and all of that, but ultimately cities are people. And so if you like people or interested in people, then you're probably interested in cities. And so, you know, I come from more the professional side, being around design and architecture and landscape architecture. But ultimately we do all of that just to make great places for people and for their interactions. And I think most urbanists are really attracted to that side of thing, the kind of the social or cultural sort of dynamics that make cities great and how they function.
Completely agree with you, Justin. I think that's my slight concern with what's going on at the moment, because I'd be intrigued to see what happens over the next 12 months. And I suppose that leads on to my next question. You know, do you feel that with the current pandemic we're in, that we're going to see increasing amounts of people look to leave urban areas and move to these suburban areas where perhaps it's slightly less congested?
Right. Yeah, so it's interesting. We're already starting to see, you know, some op-eds and kind of think pieces about this issue in the news, or at least here in the US. There have been a lot of conversations about density, right? That, you know, coronavirus and the pandemic are connected in some ways to the density of a place. And it's become sort of a narrative that is, you know, has some truth to it, but I don't think is absolute. I mean, obviously, you know, Seoul, Korea, right, it has density and hasn't seen some of the same kind of impacts that we've seen here in New York. So, you know, I think that the notion of coronavirus and the pandemic being the kind of the impetus for an exodus or for the death of the city in and of itself is probably an exaggeration. I do think kind of what happens next is going to be a bigger indicator for the success of cities and higher density living going forward. Here in New York, obviously, you know, there's political and economic concern about the ability for the federal government to lend much needed support to the city. And that is a political conversation. This is something that happened to New York in the past. You know, Ford, the newspaper headline, "Drop Dead to New York." And there's a danger of that happening again, right? That players in Washington can create a political and economic situation that doesn't support the vibrancy of the city. But I think that, the one thing about New York, at least, cities in general, but New York especially, is that they are incredibly resilient places, right? So students of history and people paying attention to this will note that, in 1918, New York City went through a pandemic. And you know what? New York City is still here. In a more recent time frame, we had the 9/11 terrorism attacks. New York is still here. We've had economic crashes, we've had all of the above, and the city is still here and thriving. So I think, people will always be attracted to each other, right? Have density to have interaction. And I think it will continue to be competitive, but we just have to make sure it's done in a way that is healthy and sustainable and more equitable than we've seen in the past and in the present.
I like that. I like that a lot, because I think the key word you mentioned there was resilience, and I think we're beginning to see evidence of that in Europe as well. I also want to ask you about another word, which is adaptability. So how do you think we will see these cities in the States, in New York? How will we see these cities start to change over the next 12 months, perhaps?
Yeah, well, I mean, most immediately is just how we're using public space in our public realm is going to be the biggest kind of adaptability challenge. Just today, the mayor announced that the city will be transforming hundreds of miles of city street space to being pedestrian priority spaces that will, take a large footprint of our public realm and change it from being for the use of cars to the use of people, right? Because there's a high need in certain communities and geographies that don't have great access to parks and public open spaces, that those spaces need to be adaptable and to be transformed to help meet the physical distancing and social distancing goals that the city has in the coming months. So that's one example. We've seen obviously a huge kind of measure of adaptability with respect to some of our social infrastructure in the city. So for example, the public school system, which is kind of an essential part of our society here in New York. There are over 1 million students in the public school system. The transition to distance or online learning that was kind of worked through with some digital divide issues, right? They had to get internet access and tablets or laptop computers to families of students who previously didn't have access to that kind of infrastructure. All right, so there's kind of, hardware and software considerations, both for the technology side, but also for the city itself, right? The physical spaces, but also how are we operating? How are we managing and caring for spaces and people? So it's absolutely an exercise in adaptability. There will be failures. There will be some successes, and there'll be the opportunity for a lot of innovation, I think, as a result of some of this.
Hopefully there might be some positive things that come out going forward. Now, also just about you as an individual. So just again on the notion of adaptability, how have you found that you perhaps have had to adapt to work in the current climate that we're in?
Yeah, well, I mean, in terms of work environment, there's obviously the big conversation now about the quote unquote essential worker and all the definitions of that and kind of how labor and power dynamics work. I mean, I'm obviously among the very fortunate and kind of privileged in society where my work and activities can largely continue by working from home, by sheltering in place is the term of art that they use. But there are obviously a lot of people who cannot, right? And there's that division between the white collar worker, for lack of a better term, and the blue collar worker. And so, my own work and the work of my agency within city government, right, we're dealing with laws and regulations, and we can work largely in this remote way. And we were able to adapt to that quite quickly, right? Online review of applications, and being able to even do our public hearings by Zoom and live stream and dial in mode. And so we were able to adapt to that pretty quickly. Other parts of city government are kind of slowly getting there to allow for its normal kind of business and processes and services to continue, so that the city can continue. So I think that part is almost the easy part. The harder part is reconciling kind of how the full infrastructure of our government and our public services are going to work, that affect the workers that are doing the maintenance work and the care work, and what's now called the frontline work that cannot be done remotely or fully aided by technology. So that's something that I think people are taking very seriously and trying to figure out kind of how do we have a more equitable and more responsible way of doing that going forward. And it includes everything from greater flexibility in work schedules to pay, to making sure that people are given the full provisions that are needed to do the best job possible.
Amazing. So, I mean, I wanted to ask you as well about your mission and the goals that you have in your current role, and even as an urbanist, what you'd like to see change over the next 2 years or beyond that period. Do you feel that the current pandemic might help you in your mission in any way? I mean, it might sound quite perverse in some aspects, but are there any positives that we can take that might support you going forward with what you're trying to achieve?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we always say, don't let a good crisis go to waste, right? And my personal agenda in work in the urban field, whether it's planning or design or policy, has been to think seriously about kind of, like I mentioned before, the kind of the social equity considerations and issues, right? Acknowledging that the world, definitely the United States, and certainly New York City are built based on difference, right? That some people have and some people do not have. And that crosses many different parameters, whether it's about social conditions, economic conditions, and environmental conditions. And all of those are connected to the real work that happens in planning and design, and especially in built environment, right? How we're physically building different parts of the city. And so, my work and career has been really focused on that. And in my current role at the New York City Design Commission, and this particular Mayor de Blasio's administration, has been this narrative about how do we get a better outcome for people that have been left out, or people that have seen long-term disinvestment or disempowerment in their communities. And so we've been doing that work in different ways. We've done research on improving the quality of affordable housing, for example, so getting more high quality housing built in different parts of the city. We've seen that with street design initiatives, so the redesign of streets and kind of mobility infrastructure to be done in a way that's more conducive to kind of a full spectrum of the society, and not geared only toward people with the most means. So all of that work is kind of built into what we've been slowly trying to do. But a lot of that work has been a lot of time and energy spent advocating for equity-centered approaches and sort of explaining to people that this work needs to happen. But something that the pandemic has done, I think, is it's sort of held up the mirror, right, or shine a light. I think Dr. Fauci said it shined a bright light, was his way of saying it, on the inequality and the severe problems that we have in our society. you know, in the US, our overall narrative is one of success and things are great and all of that, but that's all built on some very fundamentally flawed systems and infrastructures. So now with what everything that's happened in the past weeks with coronavirus and seeing, you know, I don't know if you've seen some of the maps and the spatial geography, like where people are the most impacted, and it's sort of not a surprise where those geographies are.
Yeah.
And then the demographic measures as well, right? So in the US, Black and Latino, who are sort of at the most disadvantaged side of society, are those who are the most impacted, right? And so now that circumstance, it's like there's real-time data, like more Black and Latino people are dying than white people, right? It's not a perception, it's not in somebody's head, it's not you didn't work hard enough, it is you are more likely to die based on the circumstances that you've been given by our shared society. And so that's a sort of a mandate of awareness that I think is happening now at, you know, different layers and audiences that it may not have been as apparent before. So it's you know, it's not a good thing. It is a bit perverse. It's not anything positive, but it is an important opportunity to take that truth that is very glaring to see if we can get different outcomes, whether that's investments in, you know, healthcare and health access, or investments in things like good quality housing, public services, public spaces in the communities that need it the most.
Yeah. I mean, I think what you've just said there is it's kind of the perfect way to summarize the situation in the communities that need it. And the sad reality is that so many of these communities don't necessarily appreciate the value and the importance of the urban planning sector. Now, in the UK, you know, it's a real problem that we're finding, trying to attract younger demographics of various backgrounds into the industry. I wanted to ask you whether you've got the same issue in New York and in the US as a nation, and what can we do perhaps to make it more attractive to those communities that, as you rightly mentioned, are actually suffering the most?
Right. Yeah, we know. I don't know if you know the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the kind of the pyramid, right? And yeah, and you know, the issue is that very often people that are dealing with more basic or essential kind of needs and issues, you know, aren't higher up in that pyramid where they're thinking of something like, you know, 50-year plans, right? Or you know, the details of some kind of parameter that will affect them in the longer term if they've got other more immediate needs. So that's a kind of a built-in problem that kind of leads to a lot of different issues. There's sort of that side, like, you know, people aren't investing in these issues because they, you know, just have other priorities importantly. And then there's the fields and the systems themselves, right? So whether it's the schools or the firms or the governments, and what kind of environment that all of those institutions create that are either welcoming and inclusive or not to people from different backgrounds. So we're, you know, in the US, I think there is a greater awareness of that. You know, there's, I don't know how many different conversations around diversity and equity and inclusion and, you know, all these things that are happening. So I think there's awareness of it, but the ability to, you know, actually change some of those things is a heavier lift, right? Because sure, there should be more people in the professions. Are you going to give all the people who can't afford, you know, $200,000 for an urban planning degree free scholarships?
Yeah.
You know, if you're not, you know, because you know, if you go through that kind of education and you get out of school and you're lucky to make 50,000 a year, you physically cannot do that, right? You can't pay your student loans, and let alone be in a position to become empowered.
Yeah.
So there's an awareness, but I think there is a lot, like a significant amount of work that needs to be done kind of on the pipeline side. And another kind of piece of it is, I think the idea of ownership and control also needs a sort of a major shift. So the narrative is that people in certain communities don't have the skills or capacity and all that, but that's not necessarily true. You could have people that are completely trained, you know, they get what's going on just as much as someone in another community does, but if they have absolutely no power or control over the outcomes in their community, it doesn't make any difference, right? So there are these kind of two like big, you know, elephants in the room that really affect the ability to have a more inclusive urbanist field. And I always tell people, you know, people that grow up in communities that have seen a lot of challenges, that are just sort of the real world, are the best possible urbanists, right? Like,
absolutely.
And experiencing directly some of these conditions, and it may not be a good, you know, peer-reviewed research paper with a good data set and umpteen policy papers that are in their roots derived from what some white man thought 50 years ago, right? That's all well and good, but there are other bodies of knowledge and other kind of approaches that could be equally relevant, but they're just never given that equal platform because of who controls property and who controls capital. Even if they control politics, if they don't control the other two, the politics don't really matter that much.
Yeah, no, I got you. And I think, you know, this is why I just wonder whether at some point in the future, you know, we'll see the urban planning profession become more popular industry than, let's say, what we have at the moment. I mean, that's the desire that we have in the UK, and that's what we're working towards. And I just wonder whether it's something that you think may eventually happen at some point.
Yeah, well, I think, and so, and part of this is that I'm an urban designer I'm an urban planner too, but my point of entry is urban design.
Yeah.
And that I think that
let's put them collectively. So let's put it holistically, urban design and planning. So
right. So like the broader umbrella of like urbanism, right?
Yes.
Urban fields, you know, combination between urban and built environment fields. If you sort of put those together, I think will be a growing and very robust and kind of constantly evolving field that will see broader interest and applicability. You know, all the tech companies, right, that are hiring and trying to figure out urban design and urban planning and urban policy in new ways are evidence of that, right? They're not stupid.
Yeah.
So yeah, I do think it will continue to grow, and hopefully by virtue of that growth and development will become more diverse and inclusive, hopefully. But the traditional fields, I think, will have to do a lot of work to stay relevant, right? And to stay empowered in that way. And I work with the American Planning Association, so the 40,000 plus member organization of urban planners in the United States, and that organization is fully aware of this, right? And they're kind of constantly saying, you know, what do we need to be future oriented about our fields?
Amazing.
What the needs are, and you know, social equity and climate, for example, are important provisions for that.
Yeah.
So even that huge organization has started to do the work of saying that we need to require that everyone that is a part of this organization do continuing education around social equity and climate issues, for example, right? Like as a part of the responsibility and ethics of being a member of the field. So there's potential, but I think there will need to be a lot of pushback from the kind of the pure private sector, right? capitalism, for lack of a better word, and the social sectors, right? The grassroots, the kind of the NGO or mission-oriented organizations to equally be invested in the idea of urban planning, policy design, and to have that be a part of their wheelhouse and kind of power dynamic, so that they can be in opposition to these other big forces, right? The, Uber and Google deciding they're going to design our cities. There needs to be a counter force to that as well, that isn't always happening in these other and more grassroots sectors, but I think it will be important that it become more common and more understood.
The APA, we've got the equivalent here in the UK, which is the RTPI, and social, environmental issues and climate change. These are very, very key topical points that are on the forefront of many, many agendas that take place. So it seems like it's definitely a global narrative. These are nice ways to sort of sum this up by asking you the final question, which is, what legacy would you like to leave, Justin?
Well, I always say my kind of short answer to that is always just to make cities better, right? And in some form, and that can look like a lot of different things. They're the kind of the big long-term projects that one gets to do and work on, especially when you're in government or some form of power. Whenever I fly into New York, kind of along the approach here, neighborhoods I can look down at and say, like, I designed that neighborhood, and it's just cool. Right? So that's the design. That's the designer in me, right? That kind of enjoys the impact of actually being a part of the kind of huge collaboration that it takes to make places and to make cities and to help transform them. So I do enjoy that side of it, the kind of the built environment side of it, of what it takes to make places that can sustain over time in the social and environmental and economic ways. And the other legacy, I think, and something that I try to do is to sort of help other people connect and understand like the importance of this work. I'm a big fan of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, where they kind of have all these different categories of all the different things that need to be done, and to help people connect the dots that all of these kind of issues and goals and objectives and challenges are things that can be changed, right, for the better. And the more that you can help people understand that, the more points of entry you have to getting a good result, right? Because I'm an architect designer, and I care a lot about, well-designed public spaces and great civic buildings, well-designed housing, right? That's what I care about. There may be someone else that cares a lot about gender equality. And both of those are equally important ideas and bases of knowledge and reasons for advocacy and action. And there's many of them, right? It could be social justice and migration. It could be innovation and technology. There are so many different entry points, but you need more people to understand that they're all kind of connected to help us get better cities and better society.
Absolutely. Justin, I think that's the perfect way to end things. So once again, I do appreciate you taking time to do this video call interview. If you're ever in the UK, I mean, it's probably not going to be anytime soon. But please do give us a shout. I mean, it'd be great to get you involved in some of the events that we have in London.
Yeah, we'd love to. I connected a little while ago with the Black Females in Architecture group.
Yes, BFA, yeah, we know that.
Yeah, so there was like an exchange that they had where they came to New York, and so there's a lot of really wonderful kind of new energy and leadership and advocacy, I think, coming out of the UK there. So
it's a great time to be in the industry, I have to say. There's a lot of spin-off groups that are now emerging, and that's why I say, it's exciting that we can even have this sort of virtual call, and who knows, perhaps collaborate at some point in the future. I mean, we are collaborating now. to be fair.
Yeah, absolutely. Would love to. It's a global kind of network that's doing stuff. I'm doing some work in Rwanda, and there's similar conversations happening there, where they're obviously in a totally different kind of environment and context, but the same needs and issues do arise, and the more we can share, the better.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, look, enjoy the rest of your week, and I'll speak to you soon.
Right, same to you. Enjoy.
Take care.